Most people believe the Standard Oil breakup of 1911 happened because the government finally found the courage to enforce a law that had been sitting on the books since 1890. That is the version taught in most classrooms, and it is not far off, except for one detail it usually leaves out. The Sherman Antitrust Act existed for 21 years before a single major trust was dismantled under it. For most of that time, nobody in Washington seemed to know how to use it, and the one attempt that reached the Supreme Court early on made the law almost useless. When enforcement finally worked, it did not shrink Rockefeller's fortune. Within a year of the breakup, his personal wealth had roughly doubled. The company got smaller. The man who owned the largest share of it got richer than he had ever been. That is the part of the story worth slowing down for, because it says something about what antitrust enforcement actually accomplished, and what it did not. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why it took so long, you have to go back before the law existed at all, to a time when a single company could control 90% of the oil refined in the United States without breaking a single federal statute, because no such statute had been written yet. John D. Rockefeller did not build that position through invention or discovery. He built it through freight rates. In 1872, Rockefeller and a small group of Cleveland refiners formed something called the South Improvement Company, a scheme with the major railroads to secure secret rebates on every barrel Standard Oil shipped, and a rebate on every barrel shipped by its competitors as well, paid directly to Standard Oil by the railroad. A competitor could not simply match Standard Oil's price. Standard Oil was being paid a bounty on the competitor's own shipments. Within 6 weeks in the winter of 1872, 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries sold out to Rockefeller. Refiners called it the Cleveland Massacre. By 1882, Rockefeller controlled roughly 40 companies scattered across a dozen states, and state corporate law created a genuine problem for him. Most states barred one corporation from owning stock in another, especially one chartered outside the state. Rockefeller's lawyer, Samuel Dodd, solved it with a piece of legal architecture that had no real precedent. Under the Standard Oil Trust Agreement, the shareholders of all 40 companies handed their stock to 9 trustees, Rockefeller chief among them, and received trust certificates in exchange. The companies kept their separate names and their separate charters. Nothing on paper had merged. But the 9 men holding the certificates now controlled every board, every price, every barrel, as a single enterprise operating under 40 different masks. The word trust, which had meant nothing more sinister than a fiduciary arrangement, became the word Americans used for the entire phenomenon of concentrated corporate power, and it stuck. Congress responded to public anger over trusts like Standard Oil's with the Sherman Antitrust Act, signed into law on July 2, 1890, by a vote so lopsided in the Senate that only one member voted against it. The law itself ran to barely a few sentences. It declared every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade illegal, and it made monopolization a crime. What it did not do was define any of those terms with precision, and that vagueness became the government's first obstacle. In 1895, the Supreme Court heard United States versus E.C. Knight Company, a case brought against the Sugar Trust, which by then controlled roughly 98% of American sugar refining. The court ruled 8-1 that manufacturing was not commerce, and since the Sherman Act only reached commerce among the states, a company that merely made sugar, however dominant, was outside the law's grasp. The ruling gutted the statute before it had done a single day of meaningful work. For the rest of the 1890s, the Justice Department brought almost no antitrust cases against industrial combinations. The trusts kept consolidating. Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, American Tobacco, and dozens of smaller combinations grew through the exact decade the law was supposed to restrain them. The pressure that eventually forced the issue did not come from courts or from Congress. It came from a magazine. Henry Demarest Lloyd had planted the first seeds back in 1881 with an essay in the Atlantic Monthly describing how Standard Oil's rebate arrangements worked, and he expanded the argument into a full book, Wealth Against Commonwealth, in 1894. But it was Ida Tarbell who turned the accusation into an unanswerable case. Tarbell had grown up in the Pennsylvania oil regions, where her father's small refining business had been crushed during the very consolidation Rockefeller orchestrated. Beginning in 1899, McClure's magazine sent her to reconstruct the company's history from the ground up, using court records, state investigative reports, and, in a detail that still surprises people, extensive cooperation from a sitting Standard Oil executive named Henry H.P. Rogers, who apparently believed he could charm the coverage into something favorable and instead handed her a roadmap. Her series, The History of the Standard Oil Company, ran in 19 installments between November of 1902 and October of 1904. It read as documentation, footnoted and specific, showing exactly how the rebate system worked, how competitors were starved of freight capacity, how the company had built its dominance through arrangements no honest market would have produced. Millions of Americans read it. The word muckraker, coined shortly after by Theodore Roosevelt himself, only partly as an insult, entered the language to describe what Tarbell and her contemporaries were doing. Roosevelt had become president in September of 1901, after William McKinley's assassination, and he arrived in office already convinced that unregulated combination posed a real danger to the Republic, even as he insisted he was not opposed to bigness itself, only to bigness that broke the law. His first major test came not against Standard Oil but against a railroad holding company called Northern Securities, assembled by J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E.H. Harriman to end a ruinous stock war between competing rail lines by folding them into a single holding structure. Roosevelt's Justice Department sued in 1902, and in March of 1904 the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Northern Securities violated the Sherman Act and ordered it dissolved. The margin was thin, but the precedent mattered enormously. A holding company, the court said, could not evade the statute simply because it controlled its subsidiaries through stock ownership rather than direct merger. That was the same legal structure Standard Oil had adopted in 1899, when New Jersey changed its incorporation law to explicitly permit holding companies, and Standard Oil reorganized itself from a trust into the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, a single corporation, legally owning the stock of dozens of subsidiaries. The device had changed its name. Its function had not. In November of 1906, the Justice Department filed suit against the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and more than 60 affiliated companies and individuals, including Rockefeller himself, in the Federal Circuit Court for the Eastern District of Missouri, sitting in St. Louis. The choice of venue was not accidental. Standard Oil's distribution practices in the Midwest, particularly its treatment of independent retailers in Missouri and Kansas, had already drawn state-level scrutiny, and Missouri's Attorney General had been building a public record the federal government could build on. The government's lead counsel, a Minnesota attorney named Frank Kellogg, appointed as special counsel for the case, faced a company that had spent 30 years perfecting the art of appearing compliant while remaining, in practice, exactly as centralized as it had always been. Kellogg's team subpoenaed records from railroads, from competitors, from Standard Oil's own subsidiaries, building a case that eventually filled a trial record running past 12,000 pages, drawn from testimony by more than 400 witnesses. The evidence traced secret rebates that had persisted well after the 1887 Interstate Commerce Act was supposed to have outlawed them, freight arrangements structured through third-party shipping companies that obscured the money's true path, and a pattern of predatory local pricing in which Standard Oil would cut prices to a loss in any market where an independent refiner tried to compete, while holding prices steady everywhere else, a practice competitors called fighting brands, designed to bankrupt a rival before regulators or the press had time to notice. The Circuit Court ruled against Standard Oil in November of 1909, ordering the company dissolved within 30 days. Standard Oil appealed immediately to the Supreme Court, and the case would not be resolved for another year and a half. In the meantime, Roosevelt had left office. William Howard Taft, his hand-picked successor, took the presidency in March of 1909, and history has not been especially generous to Taft's reputation as a trust-buster, largely because Roosevelt had claimed the title so loudly and so early. The record tells a different story. Taft's Justice Department filed roughly twice as many antitrust suits during his single term as Roosevelt's had filed across nearly 8 years in office. Taft simply did it without the theater, issuing no ultimatums to Wall Street, giving no speeches about malefactors of great wealth. He treated it as administrative work rather than as a crusade, which is part of why the credit for breaking up Standard Oil still goes overwhelmingly to the president who left office 2 years before the breakup actually happened. The Supreme Court finally ruled on May 15, 1911. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White wrote the majority opinion, and he used it to do something the plain text of the Sherman Act had never explicitly authorized. White introduced what became known as the rule of reason, holding that the statute did not actually forbid every combination that restrained trade in some technical sense, only those that restrained it unreasonably. A company could grow large through normal competitive success without violating the law. What made Standard Oil's conduct illegal, White wrote, was the specific intent behind its methods, the deliberate use of rebates, predatory pricing, and espionage against competitors to eliminate rivalry rather than win it fairly. Under that standard, Standard Oil's history of the past 40 years left little room for doubt, and the court upheld the dissolution order in full. Justice John Marshall Harlan, who had also been the lone dissenter in the Knight case 16 years earlier, agreed with the outcome but wrote separately to object to the reasoning itself. Harlan argued that Congress had written an absolute prohibition, and that the court had no authority to soften it into a case-by-case judgment call, a change he warned would hand future courts wide discretion to decide which monopolies counted as reasonable and which did not. Harlan's objection would prove prescient. The rule of reason became the dominant framework for American antitrust law for the next century, and legal historians still argue over whether White's innovation saved the statute from irrelevance or defanged it by degrees, deciding case by case what 1890 had been written to forbid outright. The mechanics of the breakup itself are the part most retellings skip, and they are the part that explains why Rockefeller ended up richer rather than poorer. The court did not order Standard Oil's assets sold off to new owners. It ordered the parent company to distribute its ownership stakes in 33 subsidiary companies directly to its existing shareholders, in exact proportion to what each shareholder already held. Rockefeller owned roughly a quarter of Standard Oil of New Jersey's stock. After the breakup, he owned roughly a quarter of every one of the 33 successor companies. Nothing about his ownership had been redistributed to anyone else. What changed was the market's willingness to value the pieces. Before the breakup, investors had discounted Standard Oil's stock, wary of a company that lived under permanent legal threat, and whose full internal structure no outside shareholder could really see. Once the pieces stood as separate, publicly traded companies with their own disclosed balance sheets, the market could price each one on its own merits, and the combined value of the fragments came out well above what the whole had traded for as a single entity under a cloud. Within a year, the sum of Rockefeller's proportional stakes in the 33 companies was worth close to double what his stake in the old Standard Oil had been worth before the ruling. Estimates of his fortune at that point run as high as $900 million, at a time when the entire federal budget was under $1 billion. The men who had spent 5 years building the government's case had not shrunk Rockefeller's wealth. They had, without intending to, shown the market exactly how much it had been undervaluing him. The 33 companies scattered across the country under names that meant nothing to most Americans at the time. Standard Oil of New Jersey kept the largest share of the old company's refining and marketing operations and, decades later, renamed itself Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Socony, then Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Continental Oil Company became Conoco. The Ohio Oil Company eventually became Marathon. Atlantic Refining became part of what is now Arco. A single company that had once refined roughly 90% of American oil had been split into pieces that would spend the rest of the 20th century competing against one another, merging with one another, and in a few cases finding their way back together. The public reaction to the ruling split almost immediately along lines that had nothing to do with legal theory. Newspapers hostile to the trusts treated the decision as a triumph of the Republic over an empire that had answered to no one but itself. Rockefeller, informed of the ruling while playing golf near his estate in Westchester County, reportedly turned to a companion and suggested he buy Standard Oil stock, since it was about to become far more valuable than anyone in Washington seemed to realize. Whether that specific exchange happened exactly as later retold is impossible to verify with certainty, but the advice, if it was ever given, turned out to be accurate almost to the dollar. What the ruling did not do, and what it was never really designed to do, was restore the independent refiners the South Improvement Company had crushed back in 1872. Those men were gone from the industry decades before the Supreme Court acted. The 1911 decision punished a structure, not the specific harm the structure had already inflicted, and that gap between legal remedy and lived consequence would define American antitrust enforcement for the rest of the century. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Part of what made Kellogg's case so damning was evidence of an internal intelligence operation that had nothing to do with refining oil. Standard Oil maintained a network of paid informants inside railroad freight offices and telegraph exchanges across the Midwest, low-level clerks and dispatchers who reported, in exchange for regular payment, exactly what an independent refiner was shipping, to whom, and at what volume. That information let Standard Oil undercut a specific competitor's specific customer before the competitor even knew Standard Oil was aware the relationship existed. It was not illegal in any statute on the books in the 1880s, because no law had contemplated a company running its own private surveillance network against rivals. By the time Kellogg's investigators reconstructed the practice from railroad ledgers and clerk testimony, it read less like aggressive business strategy and more like a company that had built its own intelligence service decades before federal antitrust law gave anyone a name for what that service had made possible. The 1911 ruling did not settle the argument over how far federal power should reach into corporate structure. If anything, it sharpened the debate, because White's rule of reason gave companies a genuine legal target to aim for, avoiding intent rather than avoiding size, and lawmakers worried that target was too easy to hit. 3 years later, in 1914, Congress passed the Cleveland Antitrust Act, closing specific practices the Sherman Act's vague language had left open to argument. Price discrimination designed to destroy competition, exclusive dealing contracts that locked retailers into a single supplier, and interlocking directorates that let the same handful of men sit on the boards of companies that were supposed to be competing with each other. The same year, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission, giving the government a standing investigative body with subpoena power of its own, instead of forcing every case to start from scratch the way Kellogg's team had been forced to in 1906. Louis Brandeis, not yet a Supreme Court justice, helped shape both statutes, arguing publicly that the rule of reason alone left too much to the discretion of judges who might not share White's suspicion of concentrated capital. Woodrow Wilson signed both bills within weeks of each other, and for the first time since 1890, the federal government had tools built specifically around what the Standard Oil case had exposed, rather than a single sentence stretched to cover whatever came next. The enforcement record in the years just before and during the Standard Oil case was messier than the eventual outcome suggests. In 1907, in a separate proceeding in Chicago, federal judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who would later become baseball's first commissioner, fined Standard Oil of Indiana $29,240,000 for accepting illegal rebates on shipments of Indiana crude, the largest corporate fine in American history to that point. Landis handed down the fine with theatrical severity, and newspapers treated it as proof the government had finally found its teeth. An appeals court threw the entire fine out the following year, ruling that Landis had misapplied the underlying statute. The reversal barely registered against the size of the original headline, which had already run on front pages from coast to coast. It was a preview of exactly the pattern that would define the whole era: a dramatic ruling against Standard Oil, followed by a quieter legal correction that limited its actual force, followed by the public remembering only the drama. The rule of reason outlived every man who argued the Standard Oil case. It shaped how the government approached U.S. Steel just 2 years later, when the Justice Department sued to break up a company even larger than Standard Oil had been, only to lose in 1920 when the Supreme Court ruled that size alone, absent the kind of predatory conduct Standard Oil had engaged in, was not illegal. Being big was not a crime. Behaving badly while big was. That distinction, drawn directly from White's 1911 opinion, gave enormous latitude to companies that grew through efficiency, acquisition, or simple market dominance, rather than through the kind of documented predation Kellogg's investigators had spent 5 years assembling. For long stretches of the 20th century, that latitude meant American antitrust law had real teeth only when a company left a paper trail as damning as Standard Oil's, and few companies were careless enough to leave one. International Harvester survived a similar government challenge later in the same decade, on nearly identical reasoning. Dominant market share, on its own, proved nothing. Both rulings drew directly on White's language from 1911, and both left prosecutors with the much harder task of proving intent rather than simply pointing to a company's size on a balance sheet. 2 of the 33 fragments found their way back toward each other more than once in the decades that followed, and not always through outright remerger. Standard Oil of Indiana, renamed Amoco in 1985, merged with the British company BP in 1998, in a deal regulators approved on the same logic that would clear Exxon and Mobil the following year, that the global oil market of the late 20th century bore little resemblance to the domestic market Kellogg had prosecuted. Standard Oil of California, by then Chevron, acquired Texaco in 2001, folding in a company that had never been part of the original trust, but had spent a century competing against its descendants. By the early 2000s, a handful of companies that traced their capital, their engineers, and in some cases their corporate seals, directly back to the 1911 dissolution, controlled a share of the global oil market that would have been unthinkable to regulators only a generation earlier, achieved through voluntary combination approved case by case, rather than through the rebates and fighting brands that had built the original empire in the first place. The strangest coda to the entire story arrived 88 years later. In December of 1998, Exxon and Mobil announced a merger, and it closed the following November, as ExxonMobil, once again the largest publicly traded oil company on Earth. Exxon had been Standard Oil of New Jersey, Mobil had been Standard Oil of New York. Two of the 33 fragments the Supreme Court had ordered separated in 1911 spent most of the 20th century apart, and then, once federal regulators concluded the merger would not meaningfully reduce competition in a global market that looked nothing like the one Kellogg had prosecuted, came back together. The government that approved the merger in 1999 was not blind to the history. It simply concluded that the world had changed enough that reuniting two pieces of the old Standard Oil no longer posed the danger the original company had posed in 1911, when it controlled the domestic market almost outright, rather than competing inside a global one against state-owned producers and rival multinationals. The Standard Oil case still gets invoked every time a new antitrust fight reaches public attention, usually as shorthand for what decisive government action against a dominant company can look like. The Microsoft case of the late 1990s drew the comparison constantly, with prosecutors and commentators asking whether Microsoft's bundling of its browser into Windows amounted to the same kind of exclusionary conduct Standard Oil had used against independent refiners a century earlier. Microsoft avoided a breakup through a 1998 government defeat and a subsequent '01 settlement structured around competitive practices, not corporate division. More recent suits against major technology platforms have invoked Standard Oil again, arguing that data, distribution, and default settings function today the way freight rebates functioned in the 1870s. A federal judge ruled in August of 2024 that Google had illegally maintained a monopoly over Internet search, a decision commentators reached for the Standard Oil comparison almost immediately, though the remedy phase of that case, unlike Kellogg's, would stretch on for years afterward, with no forced breakup guaranteed, and no 33-way division of assets assumed as the obvious outcome the way it had been in 1911. Whether any of these modern cases end the way the 1911 case ended remains an open legal question, and history's only firm lesson so far is that even a decisive ruling against a dominant company does not guarantee the outcome regulators expect. Rockefeller did not walk away poorer. He walked away holding a diversified portfolio the market suddenly knew how to price correctly, in an industry that within a decade would be transformed again by the automobile, expanding demand for the very product his fragmented empire still controlled, in pieces, across most of the country. Progressive reformers noticed the gap between the ruling's symbolism and its actual effect almost immediately. Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who had spent years pushing for tighter federal control over corporate combinations, argued publicly that a dissolution which left every dollar of ownership in the same hands it started in was closer to a reorganization than a punishment. La Follette and allies in Congress pushed in the years after 1911 for stronger tools, arguing that antitrust law needed the power to reach ownership itself and not just corporate form, an argument that would echo through debates over corporate power for the rest of the century without ever fully being resolved. The complaint was not that the court had gotten the law wrong, it was that the law itself, even enforced as written, had never been built to touch personal fortune, only corporate structure, and those turned out to be two very different things. Rockefeller spent his final decades doing what the breakup had inadvertently made easier, converting a reputation built on rebates and ruined competitors into one built on public giving. He had begun handing out dimes to children on the golf course years earlier, a habit newspapers mocked as a stunt, but the giving behind it was substantial and grew more organized over time. In 1913, 2 years after the breakup, he formally chartered the Rockefeller Foundation, consolidating decades of medical, educational, and public health funding under a single institutional structure that would eventually help fund the eradication of hookworm across the American South and support the discovery of a yellow fever vaccine. By the time he died in 1937 at the age of 97, having given away, by his own foundation's later accounting, more than $500 million over his lifetime, the obituaries treated him as often as a philanthropist as they did the man Ida Tarbell had spent 2 years exposing. Both descriptions were accurate. Neither one required the other to be false. The breakup also reshaped an industry most Americans never think about when they picture antitrust law: gas station signage. Before 1911, a single set of Standard Oil marks appeared, with minor regional variation, on retail outlets across most of the country. After the dissolution, each of the 33 companies had to build its own retail identity from a market that had never required one. Esso, Sohio, Amoco's Torch and Oval, Chevron's Blue and Red Chevron, and a dozen other marks emerged over the following decades, each company competing not just on price, but on brand loyalty, in a way the undivided trust had never needed to bother with. The visual landscape of the American highway, the specific mix of gas station colors and logos that defined roadside commerce for most of the 20th century, traces back in a fairly direct line to a Supreme Court order that had nothing to do with signage and everything to do with stock certificates, filed away in a courthouse most of the drivers pulling up to those pumps never once thought about. Frank Kellogg, the attorney who had built the government's case from scratch in a St. Louis courtroom, went on to a career that outgrew the trial almost entirely. He served as a United States Senator from Minnesota, then as Ambassador to the United Kingdom, then as Secretary of State under Calvin Coolidge, where in 1928 he co-authored the Kellogg-Briand Pact, an international agreement renouncing war as an instrument of national policy, signed by dozens of nations and later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The man who spent 5 years reconstructing freight rebates and secret stock transfers to prove a company had strangled its competitors ended his public life negotiating an agreement meant to strangle war itself, a trajectory almost nobody watching the Standard Oil trial in 1906 could have predicted for him. Ida Tarbell lived until 1944, long enough to watch the industry she had spent 2 years documenting reorganize itself into the shape it would keep for most of the century. She never fully embraced the label muckraker, and in later interviews she pushed back against being remembered only for the Standard Oil series, pointing out that she had also written admiring biographies of figures like Abraham Lincoln. History remembered the Standard Oil work anyway, because it had done something her later biographies never managed to do. It had changed the outcome of a legal case that was still working its way through the courts, a full 8 years after her final installment ran, built page by page from records nobody in Washington had bothered to assemble before she did. 21 years passed between the day the Sherman Act became law and the day it actually dismantled the company it was written to restrain. It took a magazine writer whose father had been ruined in the oil fields of Pennsylvania to make the public care. It took a railroad case decided by a single vote to establish that a holding company could not hide behind its paperwork. It took a Missouri courtroom, a trial record running past 12,000 pages, and a president history remembers as cautious rather than bold to actually finish what his more famous predecessor had started. And when the verdict finally landed, the law did exactly what it said it would do, and nothing more than that. It broke the company into 33 pieces, scattered across state lines and stock exchanges, competing against each other under new names and new logos. It never claimed it would make the man who built it any poorer, and on that count, measured a year later in the rising price of 33 separate stock certificates, it did not come close. The law had been written to end a monopoly. It ended the monopoly. What it did with the fortune that monopoly had produced was never really its job, and 1890s Congress, drafting a single vague paragraph and hoping the courts would fill in the rest, had never quite decided whether that distinction mattered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.